Welcome to this training on Auditee-Auditor relations, laying the foundation and building the relationship with external auditors. You might be asking yourself, what does the auditor-auditee relationship have to do with the success or failure of my external audit? Well, to be honest with you, we all know that having a strong internal audit program is certainly a good indicator of success when it comes to external audits. But what I would like to share with you are some intangible best practices that can also aid in the success of your external audits. As an auditor for AS 9100 and NADCAP for more than 10 years, I have seen the gamut of audit situations. And it amazes me that during the first 30 to 60 minutes of being on site, usually by the time the opening meeting has ended, I have a pretty good idea for how that audit is going to go for the rest of the time I'm going to be there. I can see things like the preparation for the audit. For example, if I walk in and the table is loaded with folders and binders and other things that the auditee knows I'm going to need to conduct this audit, that's a pretty strong indicator. But if I walk into the conference room for the opening meeting and get instructed by the quality manager that it's just going to be me and you, nobody else wants to be here, then that's not so strong of an indicator. If management doesn't want to participate in your external audit, that's not a good sign. I've also been in situations where communication is an issue. Now, I've parked my car and got my briefcase and got my other things together and walked into the front door only to be told, hey, you can't park there. You got to go down to the corner and turn left, and down there's another parking lot. You got to go down there and park. It might have been nice to know that before I got to the facility. Likewise, some of us don't like putting our feet in those used work boots that you have to offer. So communicating with the auditor about the necessary PPE is important so that we have the opportunity to bring our own steel toe shoes, to bring our own helmet or hard hat, maybe even a vest, right? As an auditor, that's my decision. But when you don't communicate with me prior to the audit what the PPE needs are for your facility, then that is an indicator that there's something wrong. Furthermore, if and when any issues or even just questions come up about your systems, I can usually tell when the person on the other side of the table is starting to be combative, right? And so if you are combative with an auditor, don't be surprised that you get additional findings, not because you were combative, but because the auditor senses that you're not a willing participant to make things better at your facility. And if I know that if I have to drag you kicking and screaming into compliance, then I'm going to write up every issue that I find. On the other hand, if the attitude of the auditee is more receptive, and when small things like a word or a phrase or something in a procedure comes up, if the auditor can see how immediately reactive the auditee is to those kinds of situations, it usually bodes very well in the mind of the auditor. Now, I'm not suggesting that you just roll over and take whatever the auditor is wanting to give you, but have good preparation, have good communication skills, and don't be combative. Remember, especially when it comes to NADCAP audits, once the auditor leaves and files their report, they're out of the picture. You have a staff engineer to deal with, and maybe even the heat treat task group or whatever commodity task group to deal with. So don't spend too much time being combative with an auditor. There are some things that you can do as we go through this presentation that will help. Now, quality system audits and NADCAP audits may be a little bit different from one another, but the issues are really the same. You need to make contact with your scheduled auditor at least a month ahead of time to discuss issues like PPE that I talked about already, but maybe even for travel arrangements. If your place is a little tricky to get to, if your address doesn't show up properly on Google Maps, if there is a hotel that you guys have a discount at, or if there's any other items, then make contact with the auditor. Now, if it's a NADCAP audit, we auditors get told to make contact with you at least 30 days prior to the audit, right? But it doesn't always work out that way depending on our audit schedule. Now, of course, we're in the middle of this pandemic and schedules have changed greatly in the last 6 months or so. But typically, an auditor may have several audits on their schedule. And maybe your audit, you don't get notified 30 days ahead of time. Maybe it's 20 or 25 days ahead of time. Try to understand and remember that while you have one auditor to get to know and to remember, the auditor is off auditing other facilities before and after visiting yours, right? So it's a little more difficult, I would say, from the perspective of the auditor as far as the communication goes. Now, if you communicate with the auditor on the items that are listed, it does a couple of things. Number one, it helps the auditor to schedule travel arrangements, to pick the hotel, to maybe you make some, I don't know, some recommendations on restaurants in the area that they might go to for meals, or you communicate about the necessary PPE, or even I've had other individuals ask me on my agenda. Normally, I handle pyrometry items on the second day of an audit, and maybe they have some kind of a conflict with personnel on the second day of the audit, and they want to know, can we do pyrometry on the first day or the third day, or could we rearrange the schedule that I put out for them? If you don't communicate those items and you wait for the auditor to get on site, it makes it much more difficult to make those kinds of arrangements or to alter those kinds of arrangements. Now, as an auditor, I would like to think that I'm pretty good when it comes to having a relationship with the auditee. So I try to accommodate as much as possible, but I can't speak for every auditor out there. What I can tell you is it's my goal as an auditor to have as little impact on your day-to-day operations as possible, understanding that you have a business to run. By the same token, understand that as an auditor, I may be still finishing up from an audit that I finished a previous week. I may be handling your audit, and I may have an audit the week after and the week after that, and so on, that I'm getting prepared for. So communicating with the auditor is of the utmost importance. Now, typically these days, it's an email, right? But don't hesitate to pick up the phone. If you've emailed the auditor and haven't gotten back a reply, pick up the phone and call that auditor. Let them know what the situation is. Discuss it with them. Any communication means necessary. Beginning this communication before the audit, believe me, will help you be more successful in the outcome of your audits. The whole thing is wrapped up in relationships between the auditee and the auditor. If the auditor gets a good sense from the auditee before the audit, they walk in the door happy, they walk in the door ready to have a good audit. But if we walk in the door after never hearing from the auditee, and maybe we've sent an email that doesn't get answered, then that can be an issue. So try to keep that in mind when you're scheduling and communicating for upcoming audits. Hopefully you've done a good job with communicating with the auditor prior to the audit, and you have a happy auditor walking in the door ready for a good audit. One of the first real face-to-face interactions that your company will have with the auditor is during the opening meeting. Now again, the auditor is going to be looking for who's in attendance. Are all of the different levels of the company represented? It sets an appearance of whether or not the auditee is set up for success. Now, during the opening meeting and from then on, it's important to follow the guide on the screen. Be kind in your exchanges with the auditor, every bit as much as you expect the auditor to be kind back to you. Same goes for being polite. Being hospitable doesn't just mean you make arrangements for lunch. In fact, if it's a NADCAP audit, you're under no obligation to do anything at all for the auditor for lunch. You can take a break and send the auditor on his way for lunch. You can work an arrangement where you bring in sandwiches or pizza or something like that. But you're under no obligation to do anything at all for NADCAP auditors. Personally, I'm more than happy to contribute if there's food being brought in or something of that nature. But being hospitable is important for the auditor, right? Pointing out where you might have a coffee station, or we got this fridge over here with bottles of water if you need it. Of course, don't leave out the location of the restrooms. All of those things are of the utmost importance when it comes to the day-to-day operations of the audit. Now, during the opening meeting, that's a time for the auditor to lay out the foundation and the direction for the rest of the audit. If you have questions, ask them. The auditor can't read your mind. So if there's something that you don't understand about the audit or the opening meeting, or if you have questions, please ask away. That aids in the communication between the auditor and the auditee. Lack of communication will lead to problems. Once the audit gets underway, it's important for you to understand that the auditor has a finite amount of time during which all of the items that are applicable to your scope of accreditation have to be covered. So your preparedness is very important to the flow of the audit. You should be prepared for the documentation that you really know ahead of time the auditor's going to need to be able to conduct the audit. How do you know what the auditor's going to need? Because you did an internal audit and you already looked at that information. It boggles my mind when I ask an auditee for a particular procedure or a particular form that comes up during an audit, and the quality manager says, sure, I'll have to go locate that. 45 minutes later, the quality manager comes back with this document. It almost leads me to believe that they were in the other room typing it up. Why didn't you know where that document was? What took you 45 minutes? Now, it could be very simple that the answer to that was as soon as you walked out the door, someone else grabbed you and said, "Hey, I got this issue and I need to talk to you about that issue." That can happen. But when that happens, you need to be a participant in encouraging the auditor to multitask, right? Have several items available. Remember, the audit is an interaction between you and the auditor. Don't just sit back and try to run out the clock. Believe me, we know when you're doing that. Don't sit back and try to run out the clock on an auditor, knowing that if they're rushing to get done with the checklists, they're not going to find all the things that they would find otherwise, because that leads to a high level of frustration with some auditors, and then they might write up findings that they wouldn't have otherwise. So encourage the auditor by having a job audit prepared. Say, "Hey, you can work on this job audit while I go and get that document you're looking for." Or, "Hey, how about if I take you out to the hardness lab and you can talk to who you need to talk to in the hardness lab while I go get these other documents?" Or maybe you're preparing job audits and you say, "Hey, I'll leave the pyrometry stuff with you and you can go through the pyrometry stuff while I go put together these job audits for you," right? Another good idea is to have your internal audit available to help guide through the audit. Now, if it's a NADCAP audit, the auditor should have access to that pre-audit that you submitted 30 days before the actual audit. And we can use that as a guide for compliance. But you should have a copy of it as well, so that when an auditor says, "Hey, I need the answer to 3.2.1, you know, by looking at your internal audit, where that information lives, what document to go and get, and what the objective evidence would be to show the auditor. All of this working together to find compliance or non-compliance is very important to the flow of the audit and the relationship between the auditor and the auditee. Now, hopefully it hasn't happened to you, but I have heard horror stories where an auditee tells me that the audit was going along great, and then on the last day, the auditor showed up with 5 major nonconformances that I didn't even know we were going to get. Well, a couple things come to mind. Number one, you didn't communicate very well with the auditor. Number two, the auditor doesn't have the best conduct when it comes to conducting their audit. So how can we avoid these kinds of situations? Well, each day should begin with a plan of what's going to be audited. And each day should end with a review that goes over 3 essential items. The first of those essential items is a recap of that day on the agenda. What did we audit today? How far did we get on whatever checklists we were auditing? The second item that should be discussed is, what's your plan for tomorrow? What do I need to be prepared for? That way you know what kinds of documents or what objective evidence to get ready for the next day of the audit. And finally, but every bit as important, you should review any issues or nonconformances that came up that day, or maybe came up on a previous day that you would like to discuss further. That way you can avoid the very situation that I mentioned where you get to the last day thinking everything is great, only to find out it's not so great. If your auditor doesn't voluntarily end the day with a review, ask for one. You need the information on a day-to-day basis Additionally, make sure that you share that information with those who aren't participating in the end of the day review. I'll tell you why. I did an audit several years ago where the facility was rather large and the opening meeting was conducted in a very large conference room with about 20 people present. After the opening meeting, we packed everything up, moved out to a small conference room in the heat treat area of the facility. There were 3, maybe 4 individuals that I came into contact with during the rest of the audit as it was being conducted. Now, each day I had a plan. At the end of each day, I did a review. But as each day went into the next day, the number of findings kept growing. By the end of the audit, the auditee had enough non-conformances to possibly fail their audit. Now, the closing meeting for the end of the audit required us to go back to that large conference room with approximately 20 people again. During the closing meeting in front of 20 people, I was bombarded with questions from management about why did you not communicate these findings with us, and they wanted to dispute each one of the findings, and we didn't know we were getting these findings, and how horrible it was, etc. Now, they put me in a difficult place. The only answer I could give them was the honest truth, and that was we, those of us who were participating in the audit on a daily basis, were well aware of these issues. Each day, at the end of the day, we reviewed these issues. Each day, I gave a list of the issues. Each day, those that were present at that review signed a piece of paper to state that they knew what the issues were. When that audit finished, I took the liberty of finding out who the staff engineer was and notified them immediately that the closeout didn't go so well, that they wanted to argue the issues, and they had a problem with communication. And lo and behold, the staff engineer a few weeks later sent me an email and said, "Thanks for giving me a heads up, because had you not warned me, I wouldn't have known what they were complaining about." So do your part, do your due diligence, that if for whatever reason management's not present at a daily review, that you take the time to inform them, send an email. Now, it's my practice to invite anyone and everyone who wants to be at the daily review to participate. And then I leave it up to you as the auditee to decide who you want to be there on a day-to-day basis at the end of the day. Now, I know you got a business to run. You got lots of things that need to be taken care of. I know your rest of your world doesn't come to a screeching halt because you're having an audit. I get it. But you still have an obligation to communicate that closing meeting or that daily review with those that probably should be told what's going on, to avoid that kind of situation, that when you get to the end of the audit, you don't have that kind of backlash from management. Okay? So keep that in mind. So what happens when an auditor identifies a problem? And there will be times when auditors identify problems, right? None of us are perfect. Non-conformances happen. First, be calm. You really have two options, or two chances, I should say, to get out of a nonconformance. One is if you can show the auditor that somehow you comply with whatever the requirement is that the auditor has raised as a nonconformance. Maybe there's a procedure that you just forgot to show the auditor, or some work instruction that the auditor hadn't reviewed yet, or maybe they missed it on the router or the traveler. So if you can show the auditor that, yes, you really do comply with whatever that requirement was, then likely you won't be getting a nonconformance for that. The other option is the auditor identifies a nonconformance, and you know that you have an exemption or an email or something from your customer, or maybe from the prime, that says you don't have to do that particular item, or you don't have to comply with that particular requirement. If you have a deviation, you need to communicate that to the auditor. That's the second way that you might get out of receiving that nonconformance. Now, if an issue is raised and it's a matter of interpretation, and the auditor is interpreting it one way and you believe the correct interpretation is another way, you might ask the auditor to send for clarification to a staff engineer or to their certification body for further clarification from the organization that hired the auditor to come there in the first place, right? Now, you may or may not get the answer that you would like, but it furthers the communication, and it gives you understanding of what that nonconformance is or is not, whether that nonconformance is or is not valid. What you don't want to do is to get into an argument with the auditor, especially on the plant floor, where you're bickering back and forth over a nonconformance. Personally, it's never happened to me on a plant floor, but I've heard the stories. It has happened to me in a conference room. I've had auditees tell me that they've already had clarification from a staff engineer 3 audits ago that that particular item, they had interpreted it correctly and it's not a nonconformance. Now, my answer to that is, hey, great, fine, show me that email that you got from the staff engineer, and then I don't have to write it up because obviously you've already been there and done that and got the email. Unfortunately, the auditee rarely comes up with the email. So this is one of the biggest points of contention where tempers flare and an audit goes south. And if it's the first or second item that the auditor has found during an audit, you can bet that every questionable call for the rest of the audit, the auditor is going to side on writing a nonconformance and letting you deal with a staff engineer. But if you can restrain yourself and be calm and talk your way through it, not a problem. So do yourself a favor and, again, don't be combative with the auditor. In the worst case scenario, the finding gets submitted. And if you truly believe that it was not a legitimate nonconformance, you have further actions with a staff engineer or even the task group to possibly get that finding overturned. So let it go. So you reach the last day of the audit. Is the auditor happy? Are you happy? or has the train come off the tracks? You know, I always tell the auditee at the opening meeting that I have two goals for every audit. The first goal is that by the time I'm done with the auditee should feel like they had a workout. Because, in all honesty, that's what you're paying for, a thorough audit. But the second goal right behind that is to be fair. I don't walk in the door with any particular agenda of how many nonconformances I need to find. I don't look for things to manufacture nonconformances. I'm truly there to take a look at the systems that you have in place for the employees to be successful in your environment. So if all has gone well, and if we have a good relationship before and during the audit, then we're probably in a good place. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't have any nonconformances. I've done audits before where I've done a closing meeting and shared with them more than enough nonconformances to fail an audit. And after the closing meeting, I've had general managers come up to me and say, you know what? Thank you for identifying our shortcomings. It really was an eye-opening experience for us. I can't argue with anything that you found, but I'm sure thankful that you identified the issues. That really is outstanding for an auditee to tell an auditor. And I don't say that to pat myself on the back, because I know there are other auditors that audit very differently than I do. But what it means is, even though that audit ultimately failed, I had built a strong enough relationship with the auditee that they felt comfortable that I wasn't there to do harm to their company on purpose, that I was just there to take a look. I'll use the cliche, a snapshot in time. I was just there to take a look and see what the requirements were. What did your customers ask you to do? What did you flow down to the rest of the company to do? And do you have objective evidence to show that it was actually done? And if things got identified along the way, I brought it up to them, I reviewed it with them, and really got them to agree to the nonconformances. So in reality, it is all about relationships. You can have a good feeling from an audit, even if the number of findings isn't what you expected. And you can have a horrible feeling after an audit that only produces one nonconformance. It all comes down to the relationship between you and the auditor. Thank you for your participation in this presentation. If you need to contact me, you can use any of the methods up there on the final slide. Thank you and have a great day.